Hello and welcome to the IPAF webinar on the safe use of construction hoists and transport platforms. My name is Brian Parker. I am the head of safety and technical at IPAF, and it's my pleasure to be your host and co-presenter today. So we really have got people joining us from all over the world today. So good morning, afternoon or evening from wherever you are joining us from today. Thank you as always for supporting IPAF and joining this webinar. A real big thank you to our two sponsors today, as you can see on the screen there, Mace Industries and Core RFID. So again, really supporting us and helping us through this. We have 122 people registered for the webinar today. And again, really thank you for joining. So just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be on the IPAF website and YouTube channel normally in the next few days, probably by the end of this week. That is also where you're able to find past webinars if you want to look at any information. We will, subject to time, have a Q&A session where I will put the questions that you submit to our panel of expert speakers today. And on that note, we have two speakers joining me today, and that is a Mr. Craig Hook and Sir Robert McAlpine, and Rupert Douglas Jones of Alimak. So guys, if you can just introduce yourselves, your job role, and interest in supporting this webinar today.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Brian. Yes, I'm Craig Hook. I work for Sir Robert McAlpine. I've been there for a very, very long time, and now I'm head of lifting, which is the sort of the planning side and the delivering side for us as a principal contractor. But I'm speaking to you today as the vice chair of the Construction Hoist Interest Group, which is one of the member groups from the CPA. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to giving you some insights from our way of thinking about hoists and transport platforms.
Thank you, Craig. Now over to you, Rupert.
Thank you, Brian. Well, it's very nice to be here. My name is Rupert Douglas Jones. I started with a hire company in 1998 and spent 17 years with IPAF on the training and the technical sides. And now I'm the Alimak Group training manager for the construction division.
Thank you, Rupert. That's really good. And thanks. And so again, some great insights there. And obviously myself, I've been with IPAF. In fact, I think it's my 5-year anniversary. Time flies. But been in the industry just shy of 30 years, and really enjoying the challenges that come. So I'm just going to share my slides, guys. Just 1 second, and hopefully you can see that coming through now. So today I will be talking about the IPAF statement on the misuse of transport platforms. However, before we get into that substance of that, I'd like to really set the scene. We will briefly look at some key statistics on incidents linked to hoist to understand the scale and, of course, the nature of the risks involved. We will then look at a handful of events, recent incidents, cases which sadly have ended in tragedy, examples that really do bring home the human cost behind the numbers and underline why this topic cannot be treated as routine. With that in mind, we'll then turn to the IPAF statement itself, its purpose, its core principles, what it asks of us all, manufacturers, contractors, operators, and regulators alike and authorities in countries. My aim for this session is to ensure we leave with a clear, practical understanding of the expectations set out by IPAF and how we can apply them to prevent avoidable harm. So I think it's really important that we understand that. So just let's jump into the numbers. So this is the global accident data through 21 to 2024. You can see over that 4-year period, we've had 41 reports with 13 fatalities from 6 countries. That's involved 47 people have been involved, and you can see the types of incidents there. Now they're the fatal numbers. So 6 mechanical technicals, 3 falls from height, 3 falls from height which were not platform, so normally climbing in and out, 1 entrapment and 1 overturn. So again, if we're going to look at why we're doing things like this in this webinar, this is to highlight these things. The one thing I will say is that I think they are highly underreported numbers. And I think it's, you guys are all capable of registering for the IPAF accident portal and putting your incidents and your data into the portal and making sure that, it really reflects, why we do these webinars and what information we have. Without that, we can't then look at guidance, we can't look at, training courses and update them accordingly. So I do really today ask all of you who are here attending today to sort of help us in terms of reporting your incidents, accidents, your near misses, the issues that you may have, mechanical or technical. They're kind of things that we really do need that information on. Now, when we look at the 2025 data, and this is provisional data at the moment, we've only received 5 reports and 3 countries from 3 countries highlighting 4 fatalities. So out of those 5 reports, we've had 4 fatalities already. 3 of those fatalities were false on the platform, and 1 fatality was an electrocution. So they are what has been reported into the IPAF accident portal. For both of those 2 past slides, and we don't carry out ourselves any investigation. What we do certainly do is to ensure that they are not duplicated reports and that we are accurately relaying the information and the figures into any global safety report that we produce, and of course the relevant sort of safety committees and technical committees. Okay, so hopefully that's kind of sets the scene. We're now just going to really touch on a couple of tragic incidents, and this incident occurred on the 11th of December 2023 when 5 workers were killed when a construction hoist collapsed. This is approximately 20 meters at a residential project in Stockholm. Now, the subsequent investigation by the Swedish authority determined that several nut and bolt assemblies that should have been secured to the mast sections were missing, leaving joints largely held by friction alone. The authority linked the failure to shortcomings in assembly checks and safety inspections. Now, this case itself illustrates how seemingly small omission in mast connections can escalate into a catastrophic loss of control, underscoring the duty to verify fasteners, integrity of joists, and inspection records. And also as well in terms of that, whenever we do a configuration change, that we do them checks again. The one thing I will probably say for the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority is the time that they took to investigate this was, we have to unfortunately look at our own country's authorities. It does take them a significant amount of time to investigate. This report was done within weeks, months, and even if you've looked, a short video on what and how it happened. So I do really applaud them for that information, because that's really quick information sharing. In Switzerland, in a place called Lausanne, on the 12th of July 2024, 3 workers were killed and multiple others injured when a combined scaffold/transport platform setup collapsed on a 19-story building. While the investigation on this particular one is still ongoing, authorities have confirmed a large-scale structural collapse across several lifts of the scaffold. Now, for our purposes, the lessons is about interfaces here. Whether a hoist or a transport platform is tied to a scaffold, the loads, the anchorage, the sequencing and inspections must be engineered, they must be documented and, of course, verified, especially during any sort of alterations and site conditions that may change. So again, another tragic incident, and underscoring, the absolute aftermath of something like this occurring. And then this year in Naples, 3 workers were killed at a renovation site when a transport platform reportedly tipped and fell several stories. Now, early accounts suggest a possible overload scenario. There was 3 workers plus the materials, followed by component failure and overturning. So, understandably, a formal investigation was opened by the authorities. Regardless of the final legal findings, this incident highlights essentials that apply to all personnel material hoists: strict control of rated loads, securing of loads within the car, the basket, regular inspections, training, supervision, and monitoring. And again, another tragic occurrence there. So, okay, so I'm going to now move on to the statement that IPAF issued some time ago, a couple of months ago, and actually on the misuse of transport platforms. Now, we're addressing instances where in some European countries, equipment that looks like a transport platform is being used beyond what the European standards allow. This creates a gap between appearance and lawful operation. So IPAF recently issued a formal safety communication to clarify the issue, set out the risks, and guide the sector towards a standard-based practical response. This message that we're given on the statement, it was for everybody in the chain, the manufacturers, the rental providers, contractors, and the duty holders, because decisions at any point can affect safety on site. So I'll dive into what's happened and why it's a problem. Now, some of you, if you're not in the region, may not know anything about this, but you may have seen the statement that's actually come out from IPAF. So certain suppliers are marketing what they call transport systems or the like that to the eye resemble a transport platforms, but they actually aren't transport platforms. The issue is around performance and safety systems. Some machines exceed 0.2 meters per second or can carry more than 7 persons, which places them outside EN 16719. At the same time, they do not either also meet the requirements for passenger hoists, EN 12159. So the additional protective measures you would expect on a passenger hoist are therefore not present. Now, we have anecdotally had references to third-party approval. Now, that does not alter the fundamental mismatch between the machine's behaviour and the standard, essentially, that should govern it. So this is something that, and apologies, I forgot to click at the same time. So if you can see there, so, again, when we've got them kind of things, these are some of the things that you need to be very much aware of. So my apologies, I forgot to click there. Okay, so what the standards actually require. So EN 16719 sets clear boundaries for transport platforms, lower speeds, limited persons, because the control measures are calibrated to that level of risk. EN 12159 for passenger hoist permits higher speeds and capacities, but only when the machine is designed, it's built and operated as a passenger hoist. And that also includes a number of additional safety measures built in. With passenger hoist, there are stringent safeguards such as enclosed cabins, controlled landings. They are also integral to safe operation at higher performance, and they're not optional. But the core principle is alignment. Capability and controls must match the intended risk profile, and the chosen standard must reflect the way in which the machine is actually being used. So what's the risks of ignoring the standards? Well, operating outside the appropriate standards elevates exposures for users and anyone working nearby, making foreseeable harm more likely. In the event of an incident, non-compliance can trigger criminal or civil proceedings and potentially complicate insurances, regardless of any sort of marketing claims that this organisation or that organisation may say. You are in between two standards. And I suppose it doesn't need me to sort of stress, but one serious incident can ripple across the industry, and that's going to undermine confidence in products, projects, providers, and they will then, as we've seen in some other industries, will stop using that product. They will then move to other products instead. We're trying to ensure that we are, correct, and we urge you to sort of take action if you do see these products. So I think, what IPAF is urging, and certainly what is the next steps, I think set and apply the correct standard for the machine and their task. EN 16719 for transport platforms within its limits. EN 12159 when passenger hoist behaviour is required. Challenge descriptions that blur categories, so a label cannot replace the protections mandated by the right standard. If it is a transport platform, keep it within the 0.2 meters per second and 7-person limits. Exceeding them changes the risks and the rules. Where you do see misuse, if you are identifying or you are made aware, raise this with IPAF, and IPAF, our intention, like the statement said, is to raise the specific cases with the relevant authority, the national authorities where we're seeing this happen. So if it happens in a certain country, our intention, if this does not stop, is to raise that with the national authority. Now, for further clarification or to discuss any particular case, please do contact IPAF. Early advice prevents avoidable risk later. So, raise that with myself to IPAF, and I can take that to the relevant chairs of the committees. Okay, so that concludes my section. What I'm now going to do now is hand over the presentation chair to Craig. Craig, over to you.
Okay. Let's see if we can make this smooth. Okay, thank you very much, Brian. It's a very, very long title. I'm ever so sorry about that. But ultimately, these are important things. There's so many parts of a supply chain that look to provide equipment that's safe to use. And there's a number of regulations and standards that are relevant and feed into the other and place responsibilities on the different on the different parts of the chain. So one of the areas to just have a nice overview of is why. Where does it all come from? Is there a rough idea of how these things act together? Now, clearly, I'm talking about a perspective from the UK. So apologies for those from around the world that you might not think this is relevant. However, the principles apply, because I'm sure that you will have these relevant standards or something similar where you are working. It all starts from the Machinery Directive. That is the document that sets out what is a safe piece of equipment. We'll look very briefly at different harmonized standards and then think, well, how does this actually apply when we take a piece of equipment and put it to work? So we'll have a look at 3 of the UK elements of regulation, again with helpful principles for all. And then an idea of the importance of your CE certification, and then safe use guidance and how that can be used for parts of the supply chain that are working in this. This is a massive topic. We are just going to do a very light touch over the top of these things. If this is raising any questions for you, then come back to us and then we will be able to hopefully answer them. Yes, it's massive and there's all sorts of intricacies because it's European legislation and it's complicated. So we'll do our best to support you. Now, we have these directives. We've got the Machinery Directive, which is our current standard for keeping and having a piece of machinery that's safe to use. That will be being replaced on the 20th of January 2027 by the Machinery Regulation. So our standards are all changing to reflect what the Machinery Regulation is requiring. It's got some new elements in it that are relevant. The reason we have this directive or the regulation is because we have hazards. Hazards are created by using pieces of equipment. You can't help it. You're working at height. You're using a structure, a lattice structure maybe, which might suffer from a collapse, of which we've seen examples of today already. So these elements of these hazards that are presented in either using a piece of equipment or putting it to work need to be dealt with. And so there are a series of things called essential health and safety requirements that are laid out in the directive and the regulation. And we need to make sure that those essential health and safety requirements are understood by the manufacturer and control measures put in place to either eliminate or mitigate those risks. And if you do all of those things, you have this marvelous thing called a CE mark, and it allows you to then sell your equipment, certainly into the UK. We have a requirement that all of these things are CE marked before we're allowed to use them. One of the challenges, though, is that these health and safety requirements are very general, and it's very hard to go, well, what does that actually mean for a designer? And there are many, many of them, and not all of them relevant, and some are worded in such a way you think, well, how am I actually going to do that? So to help people, we write European standards. So there's 3 examples of European standards written on the screen. And these documents provide a state-of-the-art way for dealing with the health and safety requirements. And they're written by manufacturers coming together and also users to say, okay, we've got to keep people safe at work, safe using this piece of equipment. How are we going to do it? What is state of the art at the moment? Let's have a gate. Oh, yeah, but not just a gate. Let's have a gate that's interlocked. Let's have a gate that's got mesh in front of it so that we can't lose materials through it. Those sorts of ideas come from bringing different manufacturers together as different users to allow us to come up with a sensible way to come up with a design that we can then apply to a piece of equipment. Now, we've got our design standard. A manufacturer will take it, come up with a design, but how does that turn into something that we can actually use, that we can be sure is safe to use, that it has actually dealt with all of the essential health and safety requirements? Well, there's a requirement on the manufacturer to create a technical file. Now, the technical file is theirs. It's for them only. It doesn't get shared. It is very unlikely as a user that we would ever get to see the technical file. The regulator, however, can ask to see the technical file if there was an incident, for example. So the technical file must exist. It must cover all of the elements of the essential health and safety requirements, because you're demonstrating we've done all of these things, which we've done through working to the design standard. Now, in order to ensure that all of the relevant elements have been dealt with, as a manufacturer, you'd have 2 ways to prove that. You could use a notified body to do a type approval. So they would look at the technical file, look at the piece of equipment, look at some testing and go, great, yeah, everything's compliant, and they'll issue a certificate of conformity. There's another way of doing it, which leads to a declaration of conformity. So it's a subtly different piece of paper. And that's where a manufacturer effectively self-certifies through their own processes that actually we have, we've met all of the essential health and safety requirements. Once you've done that, you can then put a CE certificate on the on your machine, a CE mark, and you will be able to declare that on the COC or the DOC. The challenge you have is that some certificates that have been seen have been faked. The equipment hasn't had that proper set of checks done in the background. Yes, it is a minefield, and no, you can't always trust the piece of paper. However, there are ways of checking whether you've got a fake or a true certificate, and that can be done through the European Union website. You can have a look there. And then for us as the user or the owner of a piece of equipment, then we would want to be keeping a copy of that document along with other certificates of incorporation. So where you buy a component, a mechanical assembly that you want to use inside your hoist or your transport platform, like a motor, a gearbox, a safety device, something like that, you would supply all that information out to the eventual owner of the piece of equipment, so they've got everything they need to allow them to use the piece of equipment safely, along with instructions for use, maintenance instructions, and spare parts manual, hopefully in a language that you can understand. So in theory now, we've got a piece of equipment that we're ready to start using. It's been properly designed, but we now have to use it in the right way. And that may well mean that we've got to import that piece of equipment to a different country. So at that point, as far as the UK is concerned, the importer effectively becomes the manufacturer. They're taking on those responsibilities, saying, we've bought this and we guarantee that it is as per the essential health and safety requirements. And so the importer has quite a responsibility. They need to know they're buying something that is good and safe to use and meets all of the criteria. So importers, buy wisely and always do your due diligence. Manufacturers, as we know, they've demonstrated that they've done their element. So when we think of the Health and Safety at Work Act in the UK, our overarching document that governs safety at work, or health and safety at work, you've got specific requirements in Regulation 6 to do with that. But then when you look at other regulations in the Health and Safety at Work Act, they would apply to the rental company, to the hirer, and to the user about making sure that equipment's properly maintained, that it's been installed properly, that we've actually thought about lift plans and method statements and risk assessments and safe systems of work and maintenance and records and trained and competent people. All of these things are really, really important. And the Health and Safety at Work Act gives us like an overarching responsibility. But then to help us out, because it's not always easy to understand all of the responsibilities. There's other subsidiary legislation that will support that, and PUA and LOLA. So the provision and use of work equipment regulations is for all work equipment, of which lifting equipment is kind of a subset. So you've got PUA over the top of it all. And PUA says, well, pick the most appropriate piece of equipment for the work that you're going to do. So I've got a choice of a transport platform, a goods hoist, a construction hoist. How do I pick which is the most appropriate piece of equipment for the activity that I'm going to do? So PUA Reg 4 says choose wisely. Write it down ideally, and then you can demonstrate you've thought about why you're using that piece of equipment. What's my task? What's the environment that I'm working in? The availability of manufacturer's instructions and maintenance requirements, again, is a requirement of PUA. And then making sure that when it's installed, it's inspected, and when it's erected, it is inspected. And we look at more detail about that in LOLA. That's unpacked in a bit more detail. We think about specific risks, restrictions of use, making sure that people are properly trained. We've got the right information and instructions available to people. Do supervisors know what they're doing? These are all really important elements, which again are even more detail is given to us in LOLA. So our lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations, which place specific requirements about safe working load for correct configuration, because machines can be configured in different ways. So let's make sure that we tell people how it's safe to be used and that it's configured properly. As we were just hearing from Brian, thinking about the transport platform, does it have a roof on it to allow you to put people in it? Is it fully surrounded? In that case, we would perhaps, if we need that, we should be using a construction hoist. And there's all sorts of elements that you need to be careful of. And so having a conversation with the supplier and understanding your own duties, understanding the piece of equipment will help you pick wisely. We need a plan, a written plan in Reg 8. And then we think about thorough examinations in Regulation 9. And what does a report of thorough examination look like? Again, this is really important, and that's explained in Schedule 1 of LOLA. And even now, when we're doing our own checks amongst our supply chain, we even now find sometimes that reports of thorough examination aren't laid out correctly, don't have the right information in, particularly the safe working load, surprisingly. That should be fairly straightforward, you would think. The importance of reporting dangerous incidents and defects is a requirement of LOLA. And again, your declaration of conformity is really important. So beyond these elements of legislation, of regulation, the HSE provide approved codes of practice that help us to understand particularly how we can do this. But then there's further guidance provided, which is not legal, but is really, really helpful. We've got the British standards, and we've got the CHIG, that's the Construction Hoist Interest Group, and IPAF documentation that sort of help unpack how do we make sure that we're legally compliant in a sensible, practical way. You can't put all of the detail into a British standard because it might be manufacturer specific. Well, we want to give good advice. So in the British standards, it's general good advice. We'll talk about gates, we'll talk about ties, but we won't necessarily go into the detail that you can do in CHIG or IPAF guidance. So there's elements there where they work really well together. If you don't follow the guidance, you could be in trouble. Not only might you have an incident, if you were to have an incident and the HSE or equivalent enforcing authority was to come and look at what you've done, they would be saying, why did you do it like that? You have examples here. What's going on? Why have you deviated from what would be considered to be good practice? So follow the guidance that has been provided to you would be my advice. And if you're going to do something different, find a better method. Don't find a less good method. Elements where we consider to be important is the independence of thorough examination. It's explained in various British standards, as you can see the examples on the screen. But then when you get into the CHIG and IPAF guidance, it explains how do we achieve independence of a thorough examiner. So, for example, not being part of the team that put the piece of equipment up. Somebody else who might work from the same company necessarily, but from a different team or a different department to come in and be independent of the crew that put the equipment up. It is important that we follow this guidance, and you'll find that the HSE or equivalent will look and go, why have you not followed the rules? Why have you not followed the guidance? Why have you not looked at these examples? They're there to help you. They've been created by your peers, by people like Brian and myself who try and help highlight what's good practice. And then I think this might well be my final slide. Training is an important element in all of this. We need relevant training to help people pick equipment properly, pick the right piece of equipment, make sure that it's set up, make sure that it's used safely as well. You can see some examples on the screen there, whether it's a CPCS card or an NPAWS CSCS card or IPAF training. All of these things are really important, whether that's for an operator or the individual who's going to be doing the selection of the piece of equipment. Ideally, you will have some initial training, and then you'll move on to maybe some form of an NVQ, which is an assessment of your training. I won't talk any more about that because Rupert will unpack that in a little bit more detail. But primarily, I want to encourage you all to make sure that you plan your work, that you manage your work properly, that it's all coordinated and monitored as per our requirements of CDM. These are essential things that will help us to keep people safe at work. And with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Rupert.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, so I'm going to take the next step. I'm going to go beyond the standards and how I see implementing of hoist training globally, which, let's face it, is a pretty tough nut to crack. So I'm going to start by breaking it down. Initially, I want to point out some of the benefits of training. Now, I don't wish to state the obvious, but I think it's important to set the scene. First of all, safety, promoting safe operation and reducing accidents. Compliance, as we've just heard, helps meet the legal regulations and industry standards. Efficiency, we can improve productivity and minimize our downtime. Consistency in the training specifically will help build trust through the global standards. And career growth, something that most of us in the construction industry are seeing as an issue, is encouraging people and new talent to join our industry. Now, this may seem obvious to most of you, but these points help to build a very strong foundation and a reason for implementing the hoist training globally. Now, the purpose of implementation of standards and creating a common language, especially for training. If the standards have been set out correctly, they will provide us with the agreed rules, best practices, which will be applicable not only across the industry, but across borders as well. The standards being implemented in different countries, however, is a whole new ballgame. Some countries, they will apply the standards directly, simply adopt them. Some will adapt them into their national regulations, and that may mean very minor changes. Some are good enough to propose their own standards, which can be adopted by others. Certainly that's happened many times, and there has to be a starting point often for a standard. But it's not all that easy. Adoptions will vary. Some will apply the standards selectively, or in some cases, reinterpret the standards. Please note the cautionary tone. I'm only going to touch on the European standards now as an example, and Craig has already covered this in much greater detail, but it still needs stating. Europe, as part of its pact, has insisted upon a harmonized approach. So the standards which are developed and published by the CEN committees must be adopted by all of the European countries. And any conflicting national standards must be withdrawn to ensure there is alignment. So we ought to see identical forms of training in all of the European countries. In practice, however, we see imbalance in the adoption, and it leads to a wide variety of different forms of training, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world where standards will vary for the above reasons. So what are the challenges in the implementation? The standards, there can often be terminology confusion. User versus operator, ones which we see regularly, which can create confusion about what should be used in each region. The cultural and regulatory barriers. In some cases, you'll see local resistance to external standards coming in, and this leads to differing expectations, especially examples that we've seen, such as practical versus theoretical emphasis. You'll see more of this now as people look towards e-learning courses, virtual reality. Language and translation issues have also caused issues, especially where there may be minor errors which can create very large or abnormally large misunderstandings, especially amongst international or multinational teams. There are challenges with the economic side of life and the disparities. If there are limited resources or high costs of certification and equipment upgrades are not happening as regularly, these will also have an effect. But we mustn't forget also the legal and liability concerns. Whilst we see in many countries we have a strong enforcement policy, in other countries the policy is nowhere near the same, and they may turn a blind eye to the standards, and there's weak enforcement, and this leads to unclear responsibilities and legal uncertainties. Now, it's the imbalance that we've been discussing that I think is worth exploring a bit more. So I want to start by having a look at the challenges affecting training outcomes across the different regions. If you get inconsistent interpretation in the standards from the issues we've just discussed, this will lead to very slightly differing standards or interpretations, and this will have a knock-on effect not only in the risk assessments and method statements, but also in the training that's provided. The varying approaches in training can lead obviously to the uneven operator competence, and some countries will simply rely upon on-the-job training, and one which we've all faced at different stages would be grandfather rights or legacy, as it may be known in some areas. So different approaches to training. Other countries, they will simply prioritize the compliance paperwork. Now, what I mean by that is they're looking for a certificate only. What's behind the certificate isn't as important. And this will lead to some short online courses with no practical element. I have seen examples in some regions of courses of 45 minutes online with no practical element at all. Although we've mentioned translation and language issues already, this has a further effect, not only from translating into the standards, but also translating into the training. And it's worth mentioning again because it repeatedly comes up. The regulatory enforcement differences and the strict enforcement versus the flexible application comes through not just in the standards, but also in the training side. And whilst we've measured or mentioned the economic and resource constraints already, these will, of course, hinder compliance in the less affluent areas and certainly have an effect on the amount of training people will expect to see or are willing to pay for. So I'm going to round up. So we know that this is a tough nut to crack, not only from the standards and making sure that they are equitable across all regions globally, but I wouldn't mention this without coming up with a solution as well. We can implement hoist training globally, but that's only if everybody plays their part. That will require the standards bodies to define and align clear standards. The manufacturers have to ensure that they're built to the standards. That's something Brian's already covered earlier today, and it may be obvious to some, but clearly isn't to everybody. The trade bodies, they have an important role to play. They've got to promote the standards and the collaboration across all of the different parties. Contractors, one of the biggest roles in enforcing the standards on their projects. In certain countries, that will be the difference between the type of training that's demanded and can make an enormous difference. The hire companies, they need to source the right machines and installed to the correct standards. Training providers should look to try and ensure that their training meets the standards that have been printed. A lot of people will simply write training courses without even glancing at some of the standards that apply. And investigators, we need to help them to uphold and enforce those standards. Now, if we collaborate and we keep consistent, clear messaging, we can crack this nut, and there will be training consistently for hoist training around the world. That's it from me. So I'll hand back to you now, Brian.
Thank you, Rupert. Great insight into that, and I think hopefully we can collaboratively crack this nut and going forward. Obviously, there are a few changes out there. One thing, in changes I mean in respect to the standards. One thing I mentioned at the start of the webinar was putting your questions through to the panel. We've only had one question, so thank you to Darren. My speakers aren't going to get away that lightly, I may add. So unless you want them to have really, really tough questions, you might not think they're that tough. Please use this time now to put your questions through. So I'm just going to, Darren's sent me a question, or sent us a question through. And his question, if I just bring it up 1 second, do the global accident figures include mast climbers, or is it solely hoist type equipment? So what I can answer to you, Darren, is, whilst Rupert and Craig was talking, I was having a look at our stats at the time, so you might have seen me looking away just to make sure I was correct. So it is, we can report on them individually, but normally as a hoist and a mast climber sector, we bound them together. So we've had 23 year to date. We've had 23 reports from 5 countries, which has included sadly 6 fatalities. Now that 6 fatalities is a significant number on the previous year's report. The number of reports, incidentally, though, is down on the same time last year. So I kind of asked that question earlier. I urge you to get some of these reports, and there are some even insignificant issues insofar as something dropped from height. That is potentially significant if it hits me on the head. But if we can have a look at this is something where where people included in this webinar today who are here can actually go and challenge the standards and look at how we can improve this. So you'll see the function at the bottom for Q&A. So hopefully, Darren, that answers your question. But I think the more we need, the more questions we need. So in the absence of any other questions, I think I'm going to pick on Rupert, because for many years I've liked picking on Rupert, to be honest, and he knows that. But I suppose you've been in this position here, Rupert, and I think how can trade bodies encourage collaboration between countries with very different economic realities?
Well, first of all, Brian, thank you for the opening to that question.
Okay.
Okay, so trade bodies, I think it's fairly important. We've discussed already the focusing on practical solutions and collaboration, but practical solutions are the important bit here. If we've got consistent standards and we can do things along the lines of facilitating local training hubs, so where you've got economic disparity in different countries, if you open up local training hubs, the costs are going to be equitable to that country. If we promote joint initiatives between major contractors and manufacturers and getting them working along the same lines, talking the same language and discussing the standards, that's going to help promote it in each region. And I hate to say this, but if the training bodies, that would include IPAF, develop equitable cost models, ones which can be applied in each region without being overly burdensome, and be mindful of the cost issues, it will help to promote the training in that area and make the machine safer. Okay. I think you're right, Rupert. Thank you for that. I think they're good responses to it. I think it's
it's something that we all collectively need to do, I support you on that. All right, let's not let Craig off the hook because we have got 8 minutes, so I can definitely fit a couple of questions in. I'm looking on the chat thing and I can't see any questions. So you've been very, very nice to us today, or you just or you don't want to ask a question. You can put them in anonymously, by the way, if you don't want your name to be read out. Craig, is there a case for greater international harmonization of hoist standards? Similar to what we've done in the mute sector, we've got 18893, which is an ISO standard. Do you think there's a greater, is there a need for this? And I suppose, what would your views be on that matter?
I think yes, it will all help. I think when I've looked at ISOs and I've tried to put comment in or have put comment in on ISO standards, there is, in my experience, a pushback from ISO to what I would consider to be a requirement for a standard. Some basic minimums I would have thought should have been applied to some particular training standards, as it happens, and they were not accepted. And so I think there's got to be will that is worldwide to take that step forward. And I think when I look at ISOs, there's a lack of detail in there that I would expect as well. So we need to have it. I think there's distinct benefits when we get it, particularly if we can get some recognized worldwide standards, because you've got one piece of equipment that is tested the same way for the different parts of the world. So you end up with probably a better tested piece of equipment that we can then use. Admittedly, we only work in one jurisdiction, so for us, we wouldn't necessarily notice anything. But having one design standard would be good. I know that we're about to start work for I think I would call it a super standard. I don't know if that's quite the right term, that will be for construction hoists, transport platforms, for hoists for materials and passenger and goods hoists as well, so that there's one standard that covers all of those pieces of equipment where there's commonality, and then specific sub clauses or sub standards for particular elements. And again, I think that will help to drive better equipment that's designed well, manufactured hopefully well as well. I think those are relevant, and I think we would probably see, I'd like to think you'd see some cost reductions because you're doing one thing once for everyone. Yeah. And you've got that, what's the word? You've got a nice uniform standard, a uniform playing field. Everyone's trying to deliver the same piece of equipment, and so that would, I'd like to think, drive some competition as well into the marketplace. But you do still need to have a wise buyer. You still need to have that importer that's doing their due diligence, a contractor that uses it, that's actually looking, is it right? I think those are all important factors, and they will bring benefits to everybody.
Yeah, and I think you emphasised that in your presentation in respect of fake certs. I was certainly privy to some fake certs that ran across my desk in relation to some serious incidents, which to the eye looked legitimate, but had actually been identified during an investigation into the sort of products that were on their site. So I think it was only by somebody actually taking the time to go and look at what products they had, then consequently found that they had some fake certificates on their site. Rupert, your organisation you work for, in terms of Alimak, do you think, and obviously from yourself, Craig, there, did the incident in Sweden trigger any further regional training requirements? Have you any experience on that?
Well, the incident happened before I joined the company, but having turned up it was instantly discussed with me. And I have to say, all credit to Alimak in following the accident. The investigation that was held internally was incredibly thorough. And when I read it, I was absolutely delighted. In terms of the effect of training, I'm here. So yes, the training has been taken extremely seriously. And I think it's sometimes following incidents of this nature, it highlights it to each region and has had a positive effect. So lessons are learned from it, but it was very professionally handled.
And I think it's obviously incumbent upon the industry to then look at, the training course themselves for these incidents that have actually occurred and see if there's any way in which we can strengthen that. And I suppose that's probably a question. As you can see, there's quite a few questions. Some of these are long questions, may I add. But I'm very much mindful that we often focus on the operator. And how do we ensure that supervisors, managers on site also receive adequate training, not just that operator? What's your views there, guys? I mean, Craig, you work for a tier 1 contractor. What's your views there? How do you address this?
From our perspective, because we own and operate our own pieces of equipment, we take it very seriously. So we will always have manufacturer training for our team. Initially, when you've got a new person coming into the industry, we won't necessarily put them on the training course immediately. They'll be starting on the ground, observing what people do, and then start to work very closely with the lead hand, with the lead erector. And then as they've proved their confidence and ability to work at height, for example, which is not everyone can do, we'll then put them into some formal training with our branded supplier. And then we're thinking about the development of that person from not only the mechanical, but into the electrical breakdowns and things like that. Those are absolutely essential because they're safe. They're keeping my equipment in good order. They're maintaining it, so it's going to be reliable. So we're going to have fewer breakdowns. All of those elements are really, really important. Irrespective of thinking about safety, we're thinking about reliability. We're thinking about our control of costs. They all work together. If you take one of those bits out, training, for example, that's a nice, easy one to cut a cost on, isn't it? But if you don't do that properly, you'll pay for it somewhere else. So yes, it's really very important that those things are considered carefully.
Okay,
Ron, I'd like to add to that if possible.
please, yeah.
I think there's a real benefit to having specialists on sites. While there's huge demand for some people working on sites to have a huge number of qualifications and courses, it's equally possible to start by having one specialist in hoists or mast climbers or different, whatever the sector they're dealing with is, to help with that site. Now, I certainly see some of the contractors coming to us and we'll work with them with the specialist knowledge that we've got. But equally, it's possible to train somebody with specialist knowledge for individual contractors. So they don't have to know everything, but they know who in their organization has got that specialist knowledge, which will help them.
Thank you, Rupert. John Joe's asked a question here. IPAF require manufacturer training as part of competency for instructors. This is very much a question for me, I guess. How can IPAF assess the level of competency of each instructor based on the manufacturer training that has been completed, as the level of training can vary substantially? I think that's a good question, that, John. John Joe, so I guess, and I'm just conscious of time, IPAF recognise that manufacturer training does vary in both depth, content, depend on the manufacturer, and what the product type that's being looked at, and that manufacturer training is, it's intended to ensure that instructors have the knowledge, the practical familiarity with the equipment, that they are being trained on. So, obviously we've got standardized instructor assessments, which all instructors must complete and periodically renew. That's going to evaluate their knowledge, their ability, they're sort of, keeping up to date. We've also got ongoing professional development. So instructors are expected to maintain, update their knowledge of equipment, and that's guided by and through the IPAF standards and the audit process. So I think the manufacturer forms one component of a broader framework, but even within IPAF's own assessments and audits, we need to make sure that these are consistent. So I think there's some more questions there. I think Scott Grant, how will IPAF ensure a range of IPAF hoist training courses are being delivered to the required standard with the current lack of auditing in this area? So I don't get involved with auditing, Scott. These are one of the things that I would normally pass through to my colleague Giles Counsel, who controls the auditing side of things. But certainly we'd be interested to understand your thoughts on this area. So there are some changes coming and that side of things. I see Dan's asked a question to which Keith has answered. The anti-standard is not aligned with other regional guidance and standards. So hopefully that fits with that, Dan, and hope you are well and over there. So, okay, look, we are out of time now. I think hopefully you've enjoyed today's webinar. I think it leads me to formally thank Craig Hook and Rupert Douglas Jones. I think Craig's either been pulled off by a hook, forgive the pun, and also thank our sponsors today, which is Mace Training and Core RFID. This webinar will be recorded, and as I said earlier, and on the IPAF YouTube channel shortly. So thank you very much for attending today, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you, Brian.